I'm joined today by Mr. Kobus Hanekom, a gentleman that I've also known for many, many years in our industry and is also very well known in the industry. Kobus has been around for the last 30 plus years and has been one of our leading lights in the industry. The latest role Kobus played was at the Sanlam Umbrella Fund, where he was the principal officer. And Kobus is now going to move out of the, let's say, the corporate world, going into doing his own thing. And I'm sure it's not going to be the last that we will be seeing of Kobus. Kobus, good morning.
Morning, Chris.
So we want to tap into your bit of experience. I mean, you've been in this industry for a long time, and I want to get, especially for the newer people, a bit of a sense from you. What have we done as an industry, say, over the last 30 years? What has been the positive things? What have been the negative things? What are the things that we can possibly learn from? And then your view of the future. Where do you see our industry going? So maybe if we can start with something like that. Does that make sense?
Well, Chris, that's a lot right there. But let me start with the easiest, and that is to say that our industry has become very, very complex. The legislation has not doubled or tripled; it's probably multiples of that. And so would be the people serving in this industry. I remember when we started the Pension Lawyers Association, we had a sunset clause, because how could you have a Pension Lawyers Association without graduates in the legal field?
Right.
And we had a sunset clause because a fairly significant number of our very, very outstanding pension lawyers at that time didn't have a degree. They just had wonderful and very good experience. And so that level of professionalization is just increasing.
Right.
These days, you have a whole new breed of independent trustees, and they can't arrive at your boardroom table without a qualification. And the same with independent principal officers. A whole new breed of individuals, and I would say law is probably the base of that, but there are fabulous individuals with other academic backgrounds operating in our industry.
Right.
If I then look at the industry itself, I would say that in certain instances, let's say on a superficial level, we've actually had a simplification. Just think in terms of your old ILPA exam paper, Chris, and all of those trick questions relating to the contributions relative, pension fund, provident fund, retirement annuity fund.
Right.
All of those things have been smoothed out beautifully. They now are based on principle, and we have these broad strokes where it's not a unique entity in and of itself with a unique set of rules. But once you drill down into the entity, then the legislation and the complexity will just be layers and layers and layers. I remember PF 86, all of those early requirements. You could make a list and count them on maybe your hands and your toes, and those will be the requirements. But if you look at what we have these days from a administrative point of view, it just dwarfs the level of information we were required to keep.
Right.
And communicate to our members a couple of years back, 20, 30 years ago. So in a sense, we've simplified, and I think National Treasury, to their great credit, supported by the other authorities, especially in the tax environment, did a fabulous job. But from the point of view of making sure that members are in fact protected, the industry has become very complex.
Right. Just as a just side observation as well. I mean, I remember when basically we came to the industry. I mean, there were over 10,000 retirement funds, registered at the time, and I think that has dwindled down now to about just over 1,300 odd, if I believe the FECA statistics. Huge reduction in numbers of funds, a lot of simplification, as you quite rightly said, and I think there's been this massive tsunami into umbrella funds, and as you said, you also had the privilege of working with the Sanlam umbrella fund, up until recently, and so yeah, I mean lots of simplification happening. So just, I also heard some people comment some time ago, yeah, but when we were moved away from DB to DC funds, people lost a lot of money and all of that, and that's certainly true, I suppose, in most cases or in many cases. But I think things are simplified a lot more. So I think from a cost perspective, it also makes a lot more sense to kind of get everything together. I mean, do you agree with that sentiment?
Absolutely. We did go from DB to DC in a big way.
Yeah.
In a very significant way. But then the shift thereafter, let's say from the late 80s, probably more the 90s, the shift started to go from a standalone fund to an umbrella fund.
Correct.
And I remember how difficult it was at the time to convince anybody in 99 that a new generation umbrella fund is such a good thing, because we've had experiences with umbrella funds previously, and that didn't work so well. But what we have now, as you say, in about 2005, we had about 16,000 umbrella registered pension funds, and about 80% of them had 100 members or less.
Yeah.
Now you can just imagine how expensive they must have been at the time, obviously with lots and lots and layers of complexity. Now there'll be a whole lot more complex. And I think even the FSCA come to realize that it is just not cost effective or appropriate to think that you can run a fund with 100 members in the appropriate way, cost effectively, in the best interest of the members. And so umbrella funds is the next generation. That's where that's where the growth is. And what we find these days, it's no longer the 100-member fund joining the umbrella fund. It is now an employer with a couple of thousand members, a couple of billion rand under management that will join the fund. And so I think that's the right way to go. Whether we've reached the right levels of cost efficiency, economies of scale, I guess there will always be work to be done in that situation. But I do think that we have an umbrella fund industry that we can be proud of.
Fair enough. I've also seen a lot more cooperation of late, between government and the industry itself. So I think there's a lot more alignment going on. I think there's a lot more communication, two-way communication happening, which I think is a good thing. I mean, has that also been your experience?
Oh, absolutely. I've been very involved in Batseta the last year or three, and we've made our voice heard when it comes to new legislation, especially from the point of view of what is inside COFI and what should be inside COFI, et cetera, especially when you do conduct standards for different kinds of funds with very different needs and aspirations. And so we've seen significant changes in the way, let me put it this way, we are very happy with the changes that the authorities have made since we've engaged with them. And I do believe that things are going in the right way. Sure. We've been talking about retirement reform for a long, long time.
Yes.
The significant changes were those tax reforms. And then the other significant changes in the late 80s, 90s were you've got to have a board of trustees. And the board of trustees must have equal representation. And then we went on to a whole range of measures such as eradicate any issue which could be interpreted as unfair discrimination.
Sure.
And then because we bought into this defined contribution package, we had to then deal with the wrongs or the pitfalls of defined contribution, because what these papers found is that we run a really, really good retirement fund. The trouble is when people retire, they have pretty much nothing to retire on.
Yeah.
And so then the debate started about compulsory provision. You've got to belong to a fund. And then compulsory preservation and compulsory annuitization. And the joy is that we've lived through these in the past few decades, sorry, not decades, from the 80s onwards. And now we have the two-pot system. and we have auto enrollment, and all of those measures, which will get us to the point where it is more likely for a person who starts employment to actually end up with a reasonable amount of money in his pension fund so that he can retire with some dignity. And so I think we've come a long way. And I think as an industry, we've done really well.
Yeah. Look, and it's also not a quick fix. I mean, all these changes are being implemented now, but I think it'll also take a bit of time for the real effect to come through. But I think we're certainly setting ourselves up for success going forward as an industry, because having done those things now, it will come through in time and show the success going forward. Given where we're at today, and what would be your sort of view for the future of our industry? I think there's also a lot happening on the convergence front. When I use the word convergence, I mean the focus more on the individual, where you'll see a lot more sort of cross-pollination between the different, what used to be separate disciplines. You had your pension fund industry on the one side, you had your healthcare guys on the other side, you had your individual life guys on the other side, and very little contact between these. Well, I think there's a lot more touch points now starting to, where the industry sees the individual exactly as such, and having to be part of those different elements to be a successful retiree one day. Where do you see things going? I mean, what is your view for the future?
Well, let me just reiterate and agree with what you say. With default regulations, we brought in significant changes. Right. The first important change is we said, trustee, you can't just sit there and manage your fund rules. You've got to take responsibility for what it is that your fund does, and make sure that you get a good outcome. And if your current rules don't get you there, then you should change your fund rules. So, for example, the trustees need to make sure that the typical member that would be enrolled into a particular product, that product is good and appropriate, for individuals like that. I think that is absolutely essential. So a whole range of measures like that were brought into being. Of course, the difficulty that we have is that our entire society is changing, and as AI and technological developments make itself known, we know that there are an increasing amount of people who will never work, and we have to be able to take care of them in one or another way. And to the extent that they work, they'll be in that gig economy, that gig culture, where it's not as if you're unemployed that you don't earn, but you're not in the formal employment structure, and it's only in the informal employment structure where you could be compelled to provide for retirement. But it's not just those people on the lower levels of the income stream. There are a number of jobs where people who are much more well paid simply choose not to be an employee. They want to be contracted, and even those individuals will fall outside the net.
Correct.
And so I think the challenge for us will be to find ways as a country, and in fact, we just one jurisdiction in the world, to find a way to deal with that gig culture. The other challenges that are particularly big is we are no longer, and let me just mention this, retirement funds at the time became something of a retail construct.
Right.
In the past, it was you're a member of the fund because you're employed. Now you can be a member of the fund without the employment, because you could be a paid-up member. And so retirement funds changed into a retail type basis to some extent. And of course, now what the government and what society requires of retirement funds is you can't just operate in isolation. There was a time when you could say, I will maximize returns for my members, and that's my constituency, and I have nothing else to worry about. What government And what social pressure now says is you've got to be sustainable in the way that you invest. And there's such a thing as infrastructure investing.
Right.
So that you you help the economy grow, so that you rise the tide so that all the boats can lift. There is a significant wave of change still coming. We've come a long way, but it's nothing compared to what we still will experience in years to come.
Fair enough. Yeah, and I think also we're one of the countries where I think we've got a very low savings culture, and I think it's also the responsibility of industry and media. I mean, side myself and colleagues with that, in terms of helping communicate, helping educate, helping teach people, the importance of making arrangements, to look out for the future for themselves. So, I remember when I came into the industry 30 years ago, the very first statistic that was shared with me was that 6% of people are able to retire, fairly comfortably. And guess what? This very well. 30 years later, there's very little change to that number has taken place. And I think it's a positive in the sense that all the changes and things that are coming into the industry now may start having an impact. And I think that's certainly the hope, start having an impact on that number, becoming a much more positive one going forward. So, Kobus, tell me, what are your plans for the future? I'm sure this is not going to be the end. So, what do you have up your sleeve?
Well, I hope I'm not going to disappoint you, but my contract came to an end as as principal officer of the fund, and I believe I'm ready to do something else.
Fair enough.
So I'm going to take a break. My wife calls it leave for a month or 2, 3. And then I'll find something else meaningful to do. What I don't want to do is I don't want to sign up for a job again and do the 9 to 5 treadmill.
Sure.
But I'll be very keen to make a contribution in one or another way that I can.
Fantastic. Kobus, I wish you all the best for the future. I really think it's been valuable and very insightful talking to you. And I'm sure it's not going to be the last that we see of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris.